August 1945. The Texas heat didn't just linger. It bore down hard, scorching dirt tracks and turning the sky into a blinding sheet of white. A military truck eased to a halt beside a barbed wire enclosure in the middle of nowhere. Inside sat 6 German women in dust-streaked olive uniforms, their faces hollow with fatigue and fear. They had been fed 1,000 warnings. Americans were savage. Captured Nazis were shot or tortured. And no mercy would be shown to those who had aided Hitler. Even if they had not been combatants, wearing the uniform meant they had touched the war. And now they were its captives. 22-year-old Ilse Kohler sat motionless on the wooden bench in the truck bed. She had grown up on images of starving German children blamed on the Treaty of Versailles, marched in school parades under swastika banners, and absorbed teachers' warnings that Americans were loud, greedy, and lawless. She expected to be stripped, searched, maybe beaten. But when she stepped from the truck onto American soil, the first thing she saw was not a barrel of a rifle, but a young U.S. soldier, barely older than her, offering a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. The soda fizzed as he popped the cap. "Welcome to Texas, ma'am," he said with a smile. In that moment, under the brutal sun, everything she had been taught about the enemy began to come apart. She had arrived expecting a prison. She had no inkling she might be standing at the start of a new life. To understand how a German woman in a Nazi uniform could end up falling for a Texas cowboy, we must first see how she wound up in Texas at all. By the end of World War II, the United States held more than 450,000 German prisoners of war, roughly 455,000 people, spread across nearly 500 camps in the South, Midwest, and West. Texas alone sheltered over 78,000 of them. The vast majority were men, soldiers of the Wehrmacht or sailors from the Kriegsmarine. But a small, often overlooked contingent, likely fewer than 1,000, were women. They were not frontline fighters but were classified as military personnel or auxiliaries. Nurses, radio operators, clerks, officers' secretaries, or civilian volunteers who had joined in what they believed was service to the fatherland. Some had volunteered out of patriotism. They were captured in different theaters, France, Italy, or Germany itself, as Allied forces advanced. Once in custody, they were treated as enemy prisoners under the Geneva Conventions and shipped, often bewildered and terrified, across the Atlantic to the United States. The voyage was long and harrowing, but the most acute terror for these women was what they imagined awaited them on the other side. From childhood, they had been raised on relentless Nazi propaganda. Posters, newsreels, radio broadcasts, textbooks that painted Americans as monstrous, degraded and corrupt mixtures of Jews, Africans and immigrants, undisciplined and savage. For women like Ilse, capture by Americans meant more than imprisonment. It meant the possibility of dishonor, humiliation, even assault. Those fears were intentional. They had been drilled into a generation. The war's end did not erase that conditioning. Yet what they encountered in Texas rarely matched the monstrous caricature. American POW camps, especially those in Texas, differed sharply from what many had seen in Europe or the Pacific. The United States, bound by the Geneva Conventions, was obligated to treat prisoners humanely. But beyond legal duty, there was also a cultural gap. Commanders, particularly in rural areas, often encouraged contact between prisoners and local communities, partly to cut costs, and partly to fill labor shortages caused by the draft. Prisoners worked on farms and in canneries. Townspeople benefited. Women, like their male counterparts, were often allowed out during the day for agricultural tasks, sometimes under guard, sometimes trusted to return on their own. That combination of freedom and trust stunned the prisoners. Inside the camps, they found mattresses, libraries, Red Cross parcels with chocolate and cigarettes, musical instruments, theater groups, and English lessons. Guards followed protocol. They did not beat inmates, and many treated prisoners politely. One former detainee later recalled, "I had never eaten so well in my life as I did in an American prison camp." For women raised on hatred, the psychological shock was profound. The people they had been taught to despise were feeding them, showing courtesy and granting them a measure of dignity their own officers had often denied them. But even more surprising were the encounters outside the wire. Ilse Kohler had been raised in a small town near Dresden, her worldview shaped by indoctrination rather than observation. Her teacher wore a brown uniform, and history lessons began with Germany's humiliation after World War I. Everything taught reinforced the narrative of betrayal and weakness, and America was singled out as one of the chief villains. By 10, she could recite passages from Hitler's speeches. She marched in youth parades and wore the armband. At 15, her family hosted a soldier home from the Eastern Front, who described American bombers leveling German cities and portrayed Americans as immoral and cruel. She believed him. At 18, Ilse volunteered as a typist for a Luftwaffe medical unit. She carried no weapon but wore the uniform. When American forces captured her near Munich in April 1945, she was processed as a non-combatant prisoner of war. She did not scream or plead. She waited for the retribution she had been warned about. Instead, she received a blanket and water. She was not stripped or spat upon. At the processing camp, someone handed her a toothbrush, soap, and a clean pair of shoes. This was not charity so much as procedure. U.S. military policy, rooted in the Geneva Convention, required humane housing, adequate food and medical care, and the right to write home. Inspections were routine and abuse officially prohibited. But for Ilse and others steeped in Nazi teaching, such treatment defied comprehension. How could the nation she had been trained to fear treat her humanely? The answer was that the propaganda machine had reshaped their emotional world so completely that ordinary decency seemed inexplicable. When the expected nightmare failed to materialize, it was replaced by confusion, and slowly a different reality. Regular meals, clean sheets, privacy, soap, books, and even Coca-Cola. Each small kindness only deepened Ilse's disorientation. The Americans' courtesy did not demand public recantations or political conversion. They simply treated prisoners with basic respect and expected similar behavior in return. One June morning, Ilse was assigned to a work detail on a cotton farm 20 miles from the camp. Her first trip beyond the barbed wire since arriving in America. She rode in the back of a pickup with 4 other prisoners and a single armed guard whose presence mostly ensured no one got lost. There was nowhere to run. When they arrived, a tall, sunburned Texan named Thomas Walker waited. He was 25, a recently discharged Navy veteran whose family farm had been depleted of labor by the draft and now hired prisoners. Thomas had never met a German woman before, and certainly never one who looked as if she had stepped out of a propaganda poster. Tall, pale, blonde hair pinned back, blue eyes that barely met his. Both were wary. Neither spoke the other's tongue. Yet as the day progressed, something shifted. Thomas brought water and Ilse helped sort cotton. He taught her to put on gloves so her hands wouldn't blister. She managed a quiet thank you in halting English. He answered with a word in German. From an outsider's view, there was nothing cinematic about it. Not yet. But it was human. For 2 people raised on opposite sides of the globe and trained to despise one another, that small exchange was more revolutionary than anyone expected. In the weeks that followed, Ilse returned to the Walker place nearly every day. The toil under the Texas sun was relentless. Everything felt sharper, harder. Yet the mood there was unlike anything she'd known for years. Calm. No air raid sirens, no shouted commands, no propaganda placards. Only endless rows of cotton, a battered radio in the barn playing country tunes, and the steady cadence of work. At first she kept to herself, but Thomas kept chipping away at the silence. He practiced saying her name right, Ilse, not Ilka, and brought her leather gloves. He offered a handkerchief when blisters formed and slipped her a lemon drop from his pocket on a slow afternoon. None of those gestures demanded anything. None of them were romantic then, but to a woman raised in a world of rigid rank and suspicion, they felt like small revolutions. Slowly, laughter returned to her. Tentative at first, as if she were testing whether it was allowed. She began teaching him bits of German. He called her Fräulein, mangled at first but grinning each time. She showed him how to say Guten Morgen. He taught her how to say howdy. Neither nailed the pronunciation. One break afternoon, Thomas handed her a notebook and pencil and pointed between them. English. They started trading short written sentences. The sky is blue. You are funny. I like music. Do you miss home? Writing felt safer than speaking. It allowed time to choose words, to guess meanings, to hope for understanding. Elsa told him she had two brothers, one dead in Russia, the other missing, and she didn't know if her parents lived. Thomas confessed he'd lost his older brother in Normandy, that his mother wept in church on Sundays, and that he felt guilty coming home when so many hadn't. They never debated Hitler or Roosevelt. They avoided politics. They wrote about rain, music, horses, and how sweet a slice of chilled watermelon could be after a long day. People noticed. Prisoners were officially forbidden from fraternizing with civilians, especially romantically. Though Thomas and Elsa showed no public affection, locals started to remark on the way they looked at each other, and how they lingered when parting. One night the camp commandant called Elsa in. He spoke quietly, without anger or threats, reminding her, "You are still a prisoner of war. You represent Germany. Don't forget who you are." She nodded, then cried herself to sleep that night, uncertain of who she had become. Thomas faced his own warnings. A neighbor told him bluntly, "You can't go falling for one of those Nazi girls, son. Folks will talk." He didn't listen. He wasn't in love yet, but he was pulled toward her. By a restrained strength, by the way she measured her words, by the sense that she was trying and perhaps as lost as he was. By September they had a ritual. Thomas tucked notes into the corner of books he lent through a sympathetic guard. Elsa answered with a pressed flower or a careful English sentence on lined paper. Then one day her absence was obvious. The truck came, and she wasn't aboard. Thomas asked the guard casually. "Her group got reassigned," the guard said. "New rotation, different camp next week." That night Thomas wrote a long, clumsy letter full of misspellings and closed it with one question. "If you leave, would you ever come back?" Elsa received it 2 days later. She read it again and again, then hid it inside her pillow without telling anyone. Something had shifted between them. Both understood it. 2 weeks later, she stepped off the work truck back at the Walker farm carrying nothing but a single letter. She had begged the camp officer to let her be scheduled there again. Not officially, which would have raised suspicion, but quietly arranging for her name to appear on the list. Thomas waited by the gate. Neither smiled. She handed him the folded, sealed note with trembling fingers. He opened it slow in the heat and dust. It read, "If I come back, it is not because I am allowed. It is because I choose to. You asked if I would return. This is my answer." That day they worked in silence, but the silence was different. Not flirtation, not fantasy, but something real. Both had made a choice, yet it was complicated. Language, uniform, war, and law still separated them. Their bond was unofficial, unspoken, unrecognized, and risky. Fraternizing with German prisoners could lead to punishment, even the prisoner's transfer or expulsion. For Americans, being seen as soft on former enemies in 1945 could ruin reputations and cost jobs. Still, such relationships were not unheard of. Across the country, dozens of quiet connections formed between prisoners and locals through shared labor, music, or classes. A handful turned romantic. Fewer endured, though the ones that did burned brightly out of sight. Thomas and Elsa found furtive ways to be together, working side by side in the fields, eating lunch behind the barn, slipping notes into hollow fence posts or between borrowed book pages. Sometimes she would hum an old folk tune her grandmother had sung, and he would pretend to guess the melody just to hear her keep going. Once he gave her a rough pencil sketch of a cotton field at dusk with the words scrawled in the corner, "For the girl who changed everything I thought I knew." Elsa tucked the drawing into her blouse and whispered, "Danke," and did not let the emotion show. Even in their small happiness, fear remained. The war had ended. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead, yet peace brought new uncertainties. Elsa had no idea what, if anything, waited for her back home. Her town had been firebombed. Letters were slow or never arrived, and rumors among prisoners spoke of hunger, Soviet brutality in the East, and shame heaped on women who survived in Allied custody. Returning no longer felt like going home. It felt like vanishing. Thomas sensed her unspoken dread. One late October afternoon, he finally asked the question they both feared. "What if you stayed?" She looked at him, hands roughened by work, face flushed, and answered slowly, "I'm a prisoner. I don't get to choose." He wasn't asking about regulations. He was asking about her heart. The following week he spoke with a local pastor about what it would take to marry a foreign national. The pastor shook his head. Impossible while she remained a POW, and even afterward it would need government permission that would be hard to get. Thomas kept trying. He wrote to his congressman, to the military, and even sought guidance from the Red Cross. Elsa quietly requested transfer to a camp nearer administrative processing for repatriation. She did not tell Thomas because she did not want to promise what she could not keep. In December, a notice came. All German prisoners would undergo mandatory repatriation processing beginning in early 1946. Medical exams, paperwork, and deportation preparations, with most expected to leave within 3 months. Elsa read the notice alone on her bunk and felt the words swim before her eyes. She had fewer than 100 days left in America. That night Thomas met her at the far edge of the Walker property just beyond the usual patrol routes. "I got your drawing," she said softly. "It's in my pillow." He took her hand with care, gentle as if handling something fragile. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "I don't care where you came from. I just want you here." Elsa was silent for a long time. At last she whispered, "Do you know what people will say about you?" Thomas nodded. "Let them talk," he replied, a remark that felt quintessentially American. Wars end and choices remain. By January 1946, the conflict was over, not only on paper but in everyday life. Soldiers returned home, factories switched from weapons to household goods, and towns filled with parades, weddings, and babies named after generals. For Elsa Kohler, however, nothing seemed settled. She existed in a gray area, not quite a prisoner, not a free citizen. Her uniform was gone and she wore plain work clothes. Her days were a cycle of labor, English lessons, and waiting. The U.S. government had begun organized repatriation. German POWs were being processed, grouped, and dispatched back to Europe by the thousands. Men went first, then civilians, then women. Elsa received orders. Report to Camp Hearn, Texas. Departure within 4 weeks. Destination Brehaven, Germany. The notice offered no promise about parents or home, and it said nothing about Thomas. When she told him, his jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Then we need to make this official," he said. He'd done some research and found a slim legal avenue. The War Brides Act of 1945 allowed foreign women who married American servicemen during the war to enter the United States legally, even if they had been enemy nationals. Elsa was not married and Thomas was no longer in active service, but precedent existed. A few POW marriages had already taken place. Rare and contested, but not impossible. Thomas found a sympathetic attorney in Dallas, made calls, wrote letters, and collected testimonials from neighbors who knew Elsa as a diligent, quiet worker rather than a fanatic. Meanwhile, Elsa was sent to Camp Hearn, the last stop before repatriation. The camp was larger and more crowded, full of anxious people, some eager to go home, others terrified by rumors of arrests, reprisals, and hunger in post-war Europe. She received one letter from home. Her mother had died in an air raid, her father's fate remained unknown, and the brother who had been missing never returned. Her world had narrowed to the Texas cotton fields, a smile, and a man who still carried her first note in his wallet. Thomas used a civilian permit to visit. They sat on opposite sides of a chain-link fence with 10 minutes from a guard. "Will you marry me?" he asked softly again. "I don't know if they'll let us," she answered. "I don't care. I'll wait. I'll find a way," he said. Her voice cracked as she replied, "Then yes, yes." Paperwork crawled through military, immigration, and local court channels. Each office required reasons and proof. In February, her leave date was moved to March 1st. Time was slipping away. Days before her scheduled departure, a telegram arrived from the regional provost marshal. A marriage license for Miss Elsa Kohler and Mr. Thomas Walker had been approved, pending in-person registration. It was a narrow opening and not guaranteed. Elsa was escorted under guard to a courthouse in Waco, where Thomas met her in his best shirt and a borrowed tie. She wore a plain white dress lent by the pastor's daughter. There were no flowers or fanfare, only a weary judge, 2 witnesses, and a whispered "I do" in accented English. That afternoon her legal status shifted, not to citizen, but from enemy alien to the lawful spouse of a U.S. national, which halted deportation pending full review. She did not return to Germany. She went to Amarillo. Rumors followed her, and townsfolk whispered, but Thomas's family stood with them. Over time, some neighbors warmed to her. Others never did. Elsa learned to bake cornbread, planted sunflowers behind the barn, and took a job at the town library teaching German to returning veterans who wanted to know the language of the people they'd fought. Whenever asked where she came from, she replied the same way: "Germany sent me here, but America made me stay." Their courthouse nuptials were modest, but to them they meant everything. In the weeks after, Elsa moved into a small farmhouse outside Amarillo. 2 bedrooms, a porch with peeling paint, and a backyard slowly healing from wartime neglect. Some neighbors greeted her. Others shut her out. An old widow who had lost a son in Belgium would not speak to Elsa for more than a year. Elsa answered with patience. She baked, helped where she could, attended church, and spoke when spoken to. Gradually, hostility ebbed not because people forgot her origin, but because they learned who she had become. In spring 1946, Thomas's mother offered a wedding gift, her old veil wrapped in lavender paper from her 1919 marriage. Elsa wore it in a second ceremony at the local chapel with music, flowers, and a borrowed dress. She said vows in English but never fully erased the past. She wrote to cousins and anyone left behind in Germany and sent care packages when possible. Canned fruit, aspirin, photographs. But replies dwindled until one day she stopped writing. She never returned to Germany, not for visits, funerals, nor even after the Berlin Wall fell. When asked, she would say simply that one life ended and another began. Elsa and Thomas endured droughts, recessions, the Cold War, the rise of television, and the moon landing. They never had children, a private sorrow they rarely spoke of, but they had nieces, nephews, and a community. Elsa became known at the library as the German woman with a sharp memory. She taught teens how to pronounce certain words and cooked spätzle for the county fair. On Veterans Day, she stood beside Thomas in the front row. Sometimes in autumn, she would sit on the porch with a pencil and pad and sketch. When a neighbor girl asked what she drew, Elsa said simply, "Memories? Before they fade." One sketch kept by a distant relative depicted a cotton field at sunset, with 4 words in her careful hand. "Everything I thought I knew." Thomas died in 1993, Elsa in 2007. They lie side by side in a small Texas cemetery beneath a shared stone engraved, "Together through war and peace." Their story never made headlines or history textbooks, granted no medals or public ceremonies, but it was one of hundreds of quiet, human lives almost forgotten. After World War II, at least 37 documented marriages occurred between German prisoners and American citizens. Some German men marrying American women, others, like Elsa, German women choosing to remain in the country they had been taught to hate, driven not by necessity but by love. These stories complicate tidy memorials and force an uncomfortable question. Even among enemies, understanding can grow. Even between strangers, mercy can arise. What the Nazi regime and its propaganda could not anticipate was that some of its most faithful young would fall in love with those they had been taught to loathe. And that, astonishingly, those people could love them back. This was not betrayal of a nation so much as a reclamation of humanity. Elsa remained German in origin, but became American by conviction. She believed in hard work, second chances, and the worth of the individual, judging people by their deeds rather than their birthplace. That belief grew not from speeches but from a cotton field, and a man who handed her a soda instead of scorn. When a local paper printed a brief obituary after her death, Elsa Walker, German-born Texas resident, beloved wife, librarian, and friend. It omitted the war, But her niece recalled the last story Elsa told. Asked whether she regretted leaving Germany. Elsa paused, then said, "Germany gave me fear. America gave me a future. I chose the future."